In January of 1906, a car shaped like an upside-down canoe rolled onto a beach in east-central Florida and went 127 miles an hour. The car was a Stanley steamer powered by a boiler, driven by a man named Fred Marriott, who'd been chosen for the job because he was the only bachelor on the crew. The beach was Daytona, and the sand Marriott drove on, 23 miles of smooth, hard-packed quartzite, sloping gently toward the Atlantic, was the fastest natural surface on Earth. That speed record stood for 4 years. The steam car record wouldn't be broken for more than a century. And if you drive to that same beach today, you'll pass a steel sign arching over the road that still reads, "World's Most Famous Beach." Beneath it, the road leads past boarded-up storefronts, vacant lots where amusement rides used to stand, and a boardwalk that a TripAdvisor reviewer recently described as not even close to its glory days. The sign is still there. What it's pointing to has mostly vanished. The sand is where this story starts, because the sand is why any of this happened at all. Most beaches in Florida are made of crushed shell, beautiful to look at, but soft, loose, terrible for tires. The beaches around Daytona and neighboring Ormond Beach were different. The grains were quartz, fine and angular, and when the tide packed them down, they formed a surface almost as hard as asphalt. In a country that had barely 100 miles of paved road at the turn of the 20th century, that mattered enormously. The automobile was brand new. Manufacturers needed somewhere to prove that their machines worked, and the sand along the Halifax River gave them something no racetrack in America could: a flat, wide, miles-long straightaway where a car could open up and show what it could do. Henry Flagler saw the opportunity first, or at least he saw it most profitably. Flagler, the Standard Oil partner who was busy turning Florida's East Coast into a chain of resort destinations, linked by his Florida East Coast Railway, had built the Ormond Hotel just north of Daytona in the 1880s. By 1903, he'd added a garage on the hotel grounds. Locals called it Gasoline Alley, specifically to lure automobile enthusiasts south for the winter. The pitch worked. On March 26, 1903, Ransom Olds in his car, called the Pirate, lined up against Alexander Winton in his Bullet for the first organized speed trial on the beach. Winton barely won, averaging about 48 miles an hour. It doesn't sound like much, but the crowd that watched it realized something the rest of the country hadn't figured out yet. The automobile wasn't just transportation, it was spectacle. The next year, William K. Vanderbilt, Jr. brought a Mercedes to the beach and covered the measured mile at 92 miles an hour, a world record. Arthur McDonald broke it the following year with a Napier at 105. Then Marriott's Stanley steamer blew them all away. Barney Oldfield came in 1910 with a monstrous 200-horsepower Benz and hit 131. Sir Malcolm Campbell arrived from England in 1928 and reached 207 in his streamlined Bluebird. Between 1904 and 1935, 11 world land speed records were set on the Daytona-Ormond stretch. For 3 decades, the most important names in the American automobile industry gathered on this one narrow strip of Florida coastline. Henry Ford used to come down and sleep in Flagler's Gasoline Alley garage to avoid paying for a hotel room. Louis Chevrolet tested cars there. John D. Rockefeller took long walks on the sand. Harvey Firestone brought his tires. The automakers were using the beach the way Silicon Valley would later use a garage, as a proving ground, a place where reputation was made in public, at speed, in front of crowds who came from Jacksonville and Orlando, and eventually from New York and Detroit. The hotels in Ormond Beach and Daytona filled up every January and February. The restaurants did well. The shops did well. The city wasn't just hosting races, it was hosting the birth of the American car culture. And the reason was always the same: the sand. It was also the sand that created the town itself, or at least gave it a reason to exist. The land that would become Daytona had been a sugar and cotton plantation under a Spanish land grant around 1800, worked by a settler named Samuel Williams. His son inherited it. It burned to the ground during the Second Seminole War in 1835. After the Civil War, a colony of freedmen, black Union soldiers and their families, settled nearby under the direction of Esther Hill and John Milton Hawks. Then came Matthias Day, a businessman from Mansfield, Ohio, who'd made his money selling sugar mill equipment and who bought 3,200 acres along the Halifax River in 1870 for $1,200. He built the area's first hotel in 1874, then 20 homes, a general store, a post office. Day was one of those restless post-Civil War optimists who believed that Florida was going to start over, and he wanted to be the man holding the deed when it did. He ran out of money within 2 years, lost the land, went back to Ohio. But the settlement kept his name, Daytona. It was incorporated as a town in 1876. It barely grew until Flagler's Railroad arrived in 1890. After that, the population surged, a 35% annual growth rate in the 1920s, when the three separate towns of Daytona, Daytona Beach, and Seabreeze merged into a single city, and a civic leader named Jerome Bergman began promoting it with a slogan that stuck: the world's most famous beach. By the time the sign went up in the 1930s, the name had already become the brand. But here is the first turn in the story, and it's one that echoes through everything that comes after. By the mid-1930s, the beach was getting crowded. Development was creeping toward the shoreline. The speed record crowd had moved on. Campbell's next attempts were at the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah, where there was more room and fewer spectators wandering into the path of a car doing 200 miles an hour. The era of land speed records on Daytona's sand was over, and in the gap it left, a young mechanic from Washington, D.C., named Bill France, saw a different kind of opportunity. France had moved to Daytona Beach in 1934, supposedly on his way to Miami, but he stopped, liked the town, and stayed. He ran a gas station on Main Street. He raced stock cars on the side, big, heavy American sedans, the kind of cars that regular people drove to work. On March 8, 1936, he entered the first organized stock car race on the beach, a hybrid course, roughly 3.2 miles, that ran south on the sand, turned onto the paved road that paralleled it, Route A1A, ran north along the blacktop, and then turned back onto the beach to complete the oval. The sand was the straightaway. The road was the backstretch. The turns were soft, rutted, chaotic. Cars fishtailed through them, spraying sand, sometimes spinning into the palmetto scrub. France finished fifth. But he understood something that the old speed record aristocrats had missed. Americans didn't want to watch exotic, one-off machines piloted by gentlemen in goggles. They wanted to see cars that looked like theirs, driven by men who talked like them, banging fenders at 100 miles an hour. That was a sport. The land speed stuff was a science experiment. On December 14, 1947, France gathered a group of drivers, promoters, and racing officials at the rooftop bar of the Streamline Hotel, a mint green Art Deco building on A1A that had opened in 1940 and doubled as the city's first bomb shelter, and proposed creating a national sanctioning body for stock car racing. The talks lasted 3 days. When they ended on February 21, 1948, NASCAR was born. The Streamline Hotel still stands on South Atlantic Avenue. 47 rooms, 4 stories, recently renovated for $6 million after years of such severe decline that a local police chief once called it a den of iniquity. During the renovation, workers found a sealed tunnel entrance in the basement that had once led directly under A1A to the beach, the passage that race drivers and local elites supposedly used to reach the hotel without being seen. The tunnel was filled in years ago when the road was widened, But the building remains, sitting there with its plaque about the birth of NASCAR, looking out toward a beachfront that would be unrecognizable to the men who gathered on its roof in 1947. France knew the beach and road course couldn't last. Development was closing in. Spectators kept sneaking through the dunes to watch for free. He started planning a permanent speedway in 1953 and signed a contract with the city and Volusia County in 1954 to build a 2.5-mile tri-oval with 31-degree banked turns, a design so steep that construction crews had to connect their paving equipment to bulldozers anchored at the top of the banking to keep the machines from rolling down the incline. The technique was later patented. The cost was $3 million, and France didn't have it. He sold 300,000 shares of stock at $1 each, mortgaged his house, borrowed $600,000 from Texas oil millionaire Clint Murchison, and when all of that ran out, started selling tickets to a race at a track that hadn't been built yet. Daytona International Speedway opened on February 22, 1959. 42,000 spectators watched 59 cars take the green flag for the inaugural Daytona 500. The posted purse was $67,760. The finish was so close that it took 3 days of reviewing photographs to determine that Lee Petty, not Johnny Beecham, had crossed the line first. The photo showed them nearly side by side, with a lapped car making it 3 wide at the stripe. It was the kind of ending that seemed designed by a screenwriter, and it cemented the Daytona 500 as the most important race in American stock car racing, which it has remained, in theory, ever since. For Daytona Beach, the Speedway was a turning point, though not entirely the one France intended. He'd built it to replace the beach course, and it did. The last beach race was held in 1958. But in moving racing off the sand and into a permanent facility on the west side of town, France also separated the sport from the beach, from the very thing that had made Daytona synonymous with speed in the first place. The Speedway brought enormous economic activity. A 2022 Florida State University study estimated its annual impact at $806 million and more than 11,000 jobs. But the money went to the Speedway zone, to hotels along International Speedway Boulevard, to the sprawl of gas stations and chain restaurants that radiated outward from the track. The beachfront, the original attraction, the reason anyone had heard of Daytona at all, began its slow drift toward irrelevance. Not immediately, and not all at once. The beachside had layers of life that took decades to erode. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Daytona Beach was still a legitimate destination, a place where middle-class families drove down from Georgia and the Carolinas for a week, parked their car on the sand, spread a blanket, and stayed at the Clarendon Hotel. The Clarendon had been operating since 1888, rebuilt in 1911 after a fire destroyed the original, at 5:30 in the morning on February 14, 1909, with 215 guests asleep inside, all of whom made it out alive. The new building was 7 stories, fireproof, with Turkish baths, a manicure parlor, a barber shop, an 18-hole golf course, tennis courts, horseback riding, trap shooting, and a 1,200-foot pier stretching into the Atlantic. Pilots flying down the coast used the hotel as a navigation point. Flying exhibitions were staged on the beach to entertain guests. The Clarendon, later renamed the Plaza Resort and Spa, was the kind of grand beachfront hotel that made you feel like you were somewhere that mattered. On the mainland side of the Halifax River, Beach Street served as the commercial downtown, the historical heart of the city. Commodore Charles Burgoyne, an early 20th century civic booster, had organized concerts along the riverfront and promoted events to travelers. The street had restaurants, shops, a sense of civic life independent of the tourists. On the beach side, there was a boardwalk built in the late 1920s with a concrete promenade and by 1938, a coquina bandshell constructed by the WPA, where the Daytona City Band and the Junior Orchestra performed on summer evenings. There was a pier built in 1925. There were amusement rides, a Ferris wheel, a roller coaster called the Sand Blaster, go-karts, arcades, and there was the simple, singular fact that you could drive your car right onto the beach, a tradition stretching back to the days of Vanderbilt and Marriott and the Stanley steamer, and park it at the edge of the Atlantic and watch the waves. 16 access ramps led from A1A down to the sand. On a busy weekend, the beach looked like a vast, sun-bleached parking lot with an ocean at the end of it. It was weird. It was wonderful. It was the thing that everybody remembered about Daytona Beach. What happened next is a story of decisions, and each one seemed rational at the time, and each one stripped away something that people actually came for. The first wave the city invited, and then destroyed, was spring break. In the 1960s, Daytona's marketing team looked south at Fort Lauderdale, which had been the unofficial spring break capital of the world since the 1950s, and decided they wanted a piece of it. They went after it aggressively. By the late 1960s, more than 100,000 students were showing up every March. By the 1980s, after Fort Lauderdale's mayor went on national television to tell students they weren't welcome anymore, Daytona inherited the entire phenomenon. MTV set up at the Coquina Bandshell in the early 1980s and started broadcasting spring break concerts. Cheap Trick, Heart, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Rem. And by 1986, the network was running all of its programming from Daytona for an entire week. At its peak in the early 1990s, as many as 350,000 students descended on the city. The economic impact was estimated at $120 million a year. And the city hated it. Not all at once and not everyone equally, but the complaints accumulated. Hoteliers said rooms were getting destroyed. Insurance claims spiked every March. Underage drinking was essentially uncontrollable. The American Medical Association would later release a statement calling spring break no longer an innocent respite from the rigors of college academics, but potentially life-threatening, noting that the average student on a break trip consumed 10 alcoholic drinks per day. In 2002, things reached a kind of grotesque peak. Scores of high school girls were handcuffed and arrested on the beach for showing their breasts. Students passed out in the street. Hoteliers reported vandalism so severe that some rooms had to be gutted after the season. The property damage, the overtime for police, the lawsuits, the image of a city overtaken by 250,000 drunk teenagers, local officials decided that the revenue, which studies pegged at about $196 million, wasn't worth the cost. For comparison, the Daytona 500 and its companion race brought in $561 million that same year. Bike Week brought $744 million. Spring break was, by the numbers, the least profitable and most destructive of the city's major events. They cracked down. They restricted alcohol on the beach. They stopped promoting the event. They made it clear, in the way Fort Lauderdale had made it clear a decade earlier, that students were no longer welcome. MTV left. The students drifted south to Panama City Beach, where the rules were looser, and then to Cancun, where the drinking age was 18 and the hotel owners didn't complain. By the mid-2000s, spring break in Daytona was essentially over. The city didn't even estimate the number of students who came anymore. The logic was straightforward. Replace the spring breakers with families, higher spending, better behaved families, who would fill the hotels year-round instead of wrecking them for 2 weeks in March. The problem was that the families never came in the numbers the spring breakers had, and the businesses that had depended on that March revenue, the bars, the shops on Main Street, the boardwalk concessions, started to close. By the 2000s, the beachside commercial district was peppered with vacancies, and spring break, supposedly vanquished, kept returning in mutant form. In March 2026, social media promoters organized unauthorized events that drew chaotic crowds. Over 2 days, more than 130 people were arrested. The city declared a state of emergency. The county sheriff implemented a nighttime curfew for minors and designated special event zones where fines were doubled and vehicles were subject to seizure. City leaders openly discussed ending the spring break tradition once and for all, as if it were still a tradition they controlled, rather than something that kept happening to them no matter how many ordinances they passed. Meanwhile, by 2018, when 4 reporters from the Daytona Beach News-Journal walked the 10.5-mile stretch of A1A from Granada Boulevard to Dunlawton Boulevard, they counted 213 vacant lots, buildings, and storefronts. 152 of them were in Daytona Beach proper. The empty buildings, the reporters wrote, bled rust and rotting wood. Vacant storefront windows were covered with crumpled brown paper, plywood, and faded bed sheets. The second thing the city killed, or tried to, was beach driving itself. For a century, driving on the sand had been Daytona's most distinctive feature. It was the thing that made the beach different from every other beach in Florida. But by the 1990s, developers had begun arguing that cars on the beach were suppressing property values. If you wanted to build a luxury resort, you needed to offer guests a quality experience, and that didn't include a parade of pickup trucks and dune buggies rolling past the pool. In 1996, the Volusia County Council passed an ordinance banning vehicles from the core tourist section of beach, from Seabreeze Boulevard to International Speedway Boulevard, contingent on the construction of new parking facilities. In 2000, when the Ocean Center opened with 1,500 parking spaces, the ban took effect. The theory was the same as with spring break. Remove the thing that was low rent, and something upscale would take its place. The county closed the beach to cars in front of proposed resort developments. Consolidated Tomoka Land Company, a local real estate firm, offered to buy vacant properties to help rejuvenate the beachside. They found that owners were irrationally attached to their asking prices, holding on to derelict buildings and empty lots, waiting for a boom that wasn't coming, unwilling to sell at prices that reflected what the properties were actually worth. The luxury developments were supposed to attract high-end tourists who wanted an unspoiled stretch of sand, not a parking lot with waves. But the luxury developments mostly never materialized. A report later noted that cities with limited beach driving had higher real estate values. But that was in cities where something else had taken the car's place. In Daytona, nothing did. What happened instead was that the Main Street corridor, which had depended on the foot traffic of people driving onto the beach and walking up to grab lunch, went quiet. The Main Street Merchants Association later said they'd lost a generation of mom-and-pop businesses after the ban. The storefronts emptied. The strip clubs moved in. In 2005, NPR reported on the oceanfront's decline. Empty storefronts, bars, and strip clubs dotting an area once touted as the world's most famous beach. The city responded by trying to use eminent domain to force remaining property owners to sell to developers, a move that generated lawsuits, bitterness, and very little actual redevelopment. The third thing was the boardwalk. In 1989, the city cleared out most of the amusement rides from the boardwalk area to make way for a new hotel, a decision that assumed the rides were holding back investment rather than generating it. The hotel was supposed to be a magnet that would draw more development. It took years to materialize. Various projects were proposed, revised, delayed. When development finally came, an event center here, a water park on city-owned property there, a cluster of chain restaurants like Bubba Gump Shrimp and Johnny Rockets and Sloppy Joe's, it never quite gelled into the vibrant destination the planners had envisioned. The chain restaurants came and, one by one, closed or limped along. The boardwalk area felt dead on all but the busiest days. The Daytona Beach Pier, which had been a central draw since 1925, aged without adequate reinvestment. As recently as 2025, the last remaining ride operators on the boardwalk were facing insurance costs that had doubled, owed nearly $30,000 in back taxes, and were rumored to be on the verge of shutting down for good, so the lot could be sold for yet another hotel development. Each of these decisions followed the same pattern. The city identified something it considered low value, spring breakers, beach drivers, boardwalk amusements, and removed it, expecting that something higher value would naturally fill the void. What filled the void was nothing, or worse, vacancy, decay, and a reputation that compounded with each passing year. And that reputation was getting worse. Between 2015 and 2019, Daytona Beach recorded 1,229 violent crimes per 100,000 residents, the highest rate in the state of Florida. The overall violent crime rate hovered around 928 per 100,000, roughly 3 times the Florida average and one of the highest in the country. The murder rate was 17 per 100,000, nearly 3 times the national average. TripAdvisor reviews of the boardwalk and pier described open drug use, aggressive panhandling, and a pervasive sense that the area wasn't safe after dark. Homelessness became visible in ways that deterred tourists. The poverty rate reached 20%, with a median household income of around $50,000, about a third less than the national median. The irony was that the Speedway, the institution that was supposed to anchor the whole city, was fighting a version of the same decline. NASCAR, the sport that Bill France had conjured on a rooftop bar in 1947 and built a $3 million cathedral for in 1959, was losing its audience. Average Cup Series viewership fell from 8 million in 2004 to 4.6 million by 2016. By 2025, it had dropped below 2.5 million per race for the first time in history, a decline of nearly 70% in 2 decades. The Daytona 500 itself, once a television event that drew 16 million viewers, pulled a 4.4 rating in 2023. Attendance at tracks across the country was down 30% from its peak. Bristol Motor Speedway, which could hold 150,000, drew 38,000 in 2019. Charlotte went from 180,000 to around 100,000. The fans who'd once made the pilgrimage, the blue-collar Southern families who saw a race weekend as a kind of annual ritual, said they'd been priced out. A family of 4 could easily spend $4,000 on a race weekend at Daytona when you factored in tickets, parking, hotels, food, and concessions that had risen several 100% from their old levels. International Speedway Corporation had responded to the attendance decline the way companies always do, by going upscale. They poured $400 million into the Daytona Rising renovation completed in 2016. New grandstands, 101,000 wider seats, 60 luxury suites, 40 escalators, 17 elevators, 3 concourse levels stretching nearly a mile along the front stretch. The architects had to account for the curvature of the earth. The project used 31 million pounds of steel. It was, by any measure, a world-class motorsports facility, perhaps the finest ever built. But it was a world-class facility for a sport that fewer and fewer Americans were watching. The original grandstands at the 1959 Daytona 500 held 42,000 people and were full. The new ones hold 101,500, and on race days, the photographs sometimes show sections of empty seats in a stadium that cost 10 times what the original track did to build. Meanwhile, Bike Week endured, the one event the city never managed to kill, possibly because the money was too large to argue with. The annual motorcycle rally began in 1937 when about 15,000 fans watched a daredevil named Ed Iron Man Kretz ride his number 38 Indian motorcycle to victory in the first Daytona 200, then headed to Main Street to celebrate. Within 4 years, the partying had gotten rough enough that city firemen had to be called to dampen the crowds with cold water, and the National Guard was summoned. By the 21st century, it had grown into a 10-day event, drawing roughly 500,000 riders and generating an estimated $600 million a year in combined impact with its October companion, Biketoberfest. It was, by a wide margin, the most reliable economic engine the city had. But Bike Week had its own complicated history. Through the 1970s and 1980s, it earned a reputation for violence, nudity, and outlaw motorcycle clubs that made city leaders deeply uncomfortable. A task force was formed. Law enforcement cracked down. The event was gradually domesticated into something more family-friendly, or at least corporate-friendly. Today, establishments along Main Street post signs forbidding gang colors. The bikers who come are more likely to be dentists on heritage softails than one-percenters on stripped-down choppers. The wildness that once made Bike Week feel dangerous, and therefore exciting, has been sanded down, much like everything else the city has touched. And here the pattern becomes almost too perfect. Daytona Beach has spent the last 40 years systematically eliminating everything that people associated with the place. The land speed records left for Utah. Beach racing moved to the Speedway. Spring break was chased to Panama City. The cars were banned from the core beach. The boardwalk rides were torn out for hotels that weren't built. Bike Week was tamed into a trade show with leather vests. Each time, the city believed it was trading up, swapping something rowdy and uncontrollable for something polished and profitable. Each time, what it actually did was subtract one more reason for anyone to make the trip. What was left? A beach. A perfectly nice beach, 23 miles of it, where you can still drive a car on certain sections if you pay the fee. But a beach in Florida is not a differentiator. Florida has 1,350 miles of coastline. It has Clearwater and Siesta Key and Marco Island and St. Augustine and 100 other beaches with softer sand, prettier water, better restaurants, and lower crime rates. Daytona's beach was never the draw because it was beautiful. It was the draw because things happened on it, because you could race a car on it, or drive your family sedan right down to the water's edge, or watch 100,000 college students lose their minds in March. Take away everything that happens on a beach, and you're left with a commodity: sand and salt water. It's the one thing Florida has too much of. The Clarendon, now the Plaza Resort and Spa, still operates on North Atlantic Avenue 130-some years after the original hotel was built and more than a century after it was rebuilt as that 7-story fireproof landmark. The lobby has been restored to something resembling its old grandeur, with columns and Art Deco touches. It's a nice hotel. But the blocks around it tell a different story. The Streamline Hotel is renovated and open, trading on its NASCAR history, but the street it sits on is not the street it sat on in 1947. A few blocks in either direction, and you're back to the vacancy, the brown paper in the windows, the sense that you've arrived somewhere that peaked a long time ago and hasn't figured out what comes next. In 2024, the Volusia County Council considered a proposal to reopen the core tourist beach to vehicle traffic, the same stretch that had been closed in 2000 to encourage upscale development. County Council Chair Jeff Brower had been hearing from the Main Street Merchants Association, the business owners who'd watched their corridor empty out over 24 years. Brower argued that removing cars from the beach had killed the foot traffic that kept the shops alive. The proposal failed, 4 votes to 2. The logic that had driven the original ban, cars are low class, removing them will attract investment, was apparently still persuasive, even though the investment hadn't come and the merchants were still struggling. Some numbers are worth holding in the mind at the same time. The Daytona International Speedway's Daytona Rising renovation cost $400 million. The state of Florida kicked in $60 million over 30 years in sales tax rebates on the promise that the Speedway would create jobs. The median household income in the city surrounding all that investment is about $50,000, a third less than the national median. 1 in 5 residents lives in poverty. Nearly 1 in 5 relies on food assistance. The crime rate is among the highest in Florida. There are 213 vacant properties along the main beachfront corridor. The Speedway is the most expensive motorsports facility ever built. The city it sits in was named one of the worst places to live in America by a study that examined 600 cities with populations over 50,000. There's a version of this story where someone says that Daytona Beach is coming back. There are always people saying that about places like this. There are renderings, there are proposals. A streetscape project for Main Street, talk of extending the boardwalk, new hotels that may or may not get built. A new slogan, Wide Open Fun, developed by a South Carolina advertising firm for $200,000, including a $44,375 monthly retainer, replacing the old World's Most Famous Beach tagline that had been working since 1920. The city paid an additional $54,000 for focus groups in Miami, Orlando, and Atlanta to test whether the new phrase resonated. This is the kind of decision that has defined Daytona Beach for decades, spending money to rename the thing instead of fixing the thing. Mary McLeod Bethune founded a school in Daytona Beach in 1904 to educate the daughters of African-American railroad workers. It became Bethune-Cookman University. Bethune herself was appointed to government positions by 5 presidents. Her home on the university's campus is a National Historic Landmark. It's one of the few things in Daytona Beach that has lasted without anyone trying to tear it down and replace it with something more profitable. The question that hangs over all of it is whether a city can unmake the choices that unmade it. Daytona Beach didn't decline because of an earthquake or a factory closing or a river changing course. It declined because, over and over, the people running it looked at what was bringing visitors to town and decided they'd rather have different visitors. They wanted the spring breakers' money without the spring breakers. They wanted beach tourism without cars on the beach. They wanted a boardwalk without the rides. They wanted Bike Week without the bikers. Every time, they got what they asked for. The spring breakers left. The cars left. The rides were torn down. The bikers put on khakis. And then, without the noise and the chaos and the slightly disreputable energy that had always been the point of the place, the visitors stopped coming too. Because the thing about a beach town is that nobody drives 600 miles to sit on sand. They drive 600 miles for whatever's happening on the sand. Take that away, and all you've got is sand. Fred Marriott survived his 1906 speed record. He came back to Daytona the following year with a faster version of the Stanley steamer, aiming to break 150 miles per hour on the beach. The car hit a rut at full speed and went airborne. It broke in half when it landed. Marriott was badly injured, but lived. He never raced again. The rut, according to most accounts, had been caused by the outgoing tide shifting the sand, a small imperfection in the surface that had seemed until that moment perfectly smooth and endlessly forgiving. He'd been chosen because he was the only bachelor. Nobody thought to ask what would happen if the sand moved. The world's most famous beach sign still arches over the road at 825 East International Speedway Boulevard. The steel frame was installed in the 1950s to replace an older wooden one from the 1930s. It's been repainted and refurbished several times. If you stand beneath it on a quiet Tuesday morning and look east toward the beach, the road runs past a parking garage, a few low-slung hotels, and a lot of empty space where other things used to be. The sand, when you reach it, is still hard-packed, still quartzite, still unlike almost any other beach in Florida. You could, in theory, still drive a car 127 miles an hour on it. Nobody does.